Okay, well, thanks again, everyone. So, as I was just starting to say, as help was in the process of arriving, and thank you so much, by the way. As I was starting to say, this is an offshoot of my dissertation, which is on the relationship between music and poetry in 19th century Germany, which, incidentally, is very much a topic musicologists have done to death. What I am doing is something a little bit different and from a comparative literature angle, because German art song is something of a best-kept secret outside of the musicological world, I have found. So, something I noticed as I am going along through my study of German art song, I found that the type of thinking that brought us from 18th century into proper 19th century German art song composition is this massive cultural aesthetic change that we know broadly as early Romanticism in Germany and the German-speaking lands. And I could not help but notice traces of what I have called this lead idea, by which I mean, just to put it as quickly as I possibly can, I mean by this, people have always set poetry to music. But in early 19th century Germany, something happened that made people completely rediscover how to do a thing that they've always been doing. They never weren't doing this, and yet it became radically completely new for aesthetic, historical, cultural, philosophical reasons, I believe. And evidence of this is succinctly put by a certain J.G. Nägeli, a Swiss music critic. And if you read what he wrote, he basically just forecast the developments in art song that were going to come about. So, to me, it seems that a change was afoot, and you can see it rippling out into all of these other works. So, now this too, old news. Everybody knows Wackenroder and Tieck wrote a seminal early romantic work, Confessions of an Art-Loving Friar, to slightly mistranslate the title, which features a composer figure, the first romantic composer in literature, Joseph Berglinger. But, interestingly, it's a strikingly unmusical text, that one. Also has been well studied. Many texts featuring musicians or musical characters have been well studied under this umbrella of how are music and literature coming together in these particular ways at this moment in time in this place. The thing that I am, with a strong bias toward my own interests, calling lead thinking. It's not just lead thinking, that's just what it means to me. Anyway, so here are some texts that are very famous for being examples of this intersection, and I am accordingly not going to talk about these ones. I'm going to talk about a couple of texts that aren't discussed as music texts. So, without too much further ado, as I was reading, I identified 5 uses, 5 connections that appear to be employable between prose fiction and music. So the first is the most obvious when you have a musical character, a composer figure, whether they are a bourgeois artist or something a little bit more folk-like, which is, of course, politically important. Either way, that's what I'm calling category number 1. Then, very crucially to this, you have the types of prose versus those that don't, that employ a lot of sonic information and appeals to sound, appeals to music, musical vocabulary, musical figures. Then, third category is when you have thinking about music, the type of actual theorizations that people are doing, making their way into the text, like in Heinrich von Ofterdingen, which we'll see characters are theorizing expressly about poetics and music. And then fourth is sometimes you actually have songs and poems that are transcribed in the text as lyrics. This is not new here. Wilhelm Meister is full of those, and so are many old romance texts, etc., etc. The first of these 4 are the ones I'm going to look at. The 5th one is a problem category, which is that business of musical prose, prose that sounds musical. That's absolutely relevant, but that's a whole other field of study I recommend Stephen Paulshare's essays on what it actually means and when it is actually useful to describe prose as musical and when that is just needlessly vague and obscuring. So for that express reason, I'm not going to talk about number 5, however musical some of what I'm about to read you may, I hope does, sound. So I've already mentioned some of the musical predecessors here, specifically this seminal composer figure, Joseph Berglinger, kind of doesn't quite do what I'm really talking about, even though that is the paradigmatic case prior to Hoffmann of the romantic composer figure. To me, that's more like a departure point for what we're about to see. So, moving on then. Okay, so here's a text that if you are fans of Brahms, you may know. If you are not fans of Brahms, I honestly can't see why you would have heard of this. Brahms set to music 15 poems that are embedded in the so-called love story of the beautiful Magalona and Count Peter of Provence, which is a retelling. So Veit von Walbeck, the old master German poet, had translated an even older French romance. Tieck works it over for the Romantic period, being an early subscriber to the preoccupation with medieval themes, being something of a quick on the draw with taste-making, Tieck was. So here is what I want to call a far more forward-looking romantic take on what it means for music and literature to converge. This is Peter falling in love. This is music mediating his sexual awakening. He heard nothing around him, for an inner music drowned out the whispering of the trees and the rippling splashes of the water fountains. 1,000 times he repeated Magalona's name to himself in his thoughts, and was suddenly horrified that he might have shouted it out loud across the garden. So, in this first onset of love-based confusion, music comes in, and it does a strange thing where it dissolves his inner and outer senses, and kind of dissolves him into the natural world. And that's something we're going to see again and again. This convergence of a young male protagonist who's undergoing a sexual awakening in a very romantic style. Music mediates the transformation, and one of the end effects is that he ends up more closely in touch with the world of nature as this communicating force. Okay, yeah, even more from Magalona. Music flowed like a murmuring brook through the quiet garden. He saw the princess's loveliness swimming along high on the silvery waves. Here where we can also see a lot of really aggressive intermixing of visual and oral imagery, very early romantic. She shined into the twilight night, and the stars stood still in their course. The trees kept calm. It has this effect on the sonic world around him, and the winds grew quiet. Music was now the only movement, the only living thing in nature. I'm not aware of writing prior to this period that starts doing things like that. And so my real point is that if we had time, I would play you the song that Peter then sings in the garden, which continues to play with the sensory blending. Do not think we have time. But, well, start playing it anyway. Main thing to take about from this is I feel we're seeing a lot of categories 2 and 4 coming forward. Moving along real quickly. Heinrich von Ofterdingen by Novalis. Unfinished seminal novel in which the young hero is coming of age as a poet, and there's a lot of very, very express theorization about the arts. This is early on in the book. He has a dream of a blue flower. The blue flower becomes symbolic throughout European Romanticism of that thing that you just can't have, the thing for which one yearns, that which is out of reach. Before Heinrich has that dream, his father had that dream years ago. This is the father's telling. In the dream, where he has seen the flower and taken notice of, knows this of it. The effect, he says, is, how fluent were my words, how free my tongue, how music swelled its strains. So here again, there is this very specific mediation by music of the character who's undergoing this type of awakening, which then also has a bearing on what happens with the natural world. And then later, we see what happens in how it changes the natural world the first time the natural world starts sounding and talking in Heinrich, the way that we already heard it sounding and talking in the Tieck text. After Heinrich is united with Matilda, a little spring gushed from the side of a hill, sounding like the music of bells. Then more, and here's some of the theoretical stuff. He sang rapturously of Matilda, your speech merely a song, your very form is expressive of heavenly music. And he says she is the visible spirit of song. Here's that interplay again with the visual and the auditory. She will dissolve me into music. So, yeah, so this is not a musician story. This is more of a poet story, but we're seeing now a very theoretical as well as sensory, I will say, permeation of the music theoretical relations throughout the text. I'm trying to move along quickly here, but I hope I'm not being too fast either. Hofmann, we have good old E.T.A. Hofmann, probably the most musically legitimate, informed of the early Romantics. He was himself a composer, was himself a conductor, respected, was actually a professional at these things, and he was the creator of Kapellmeister Kreisler, who was the cartoon in the opening slides, wrote many very explicitly musical things. The Golden Pot is not one of them, and yet I like reading it here in this context because that is some of the most musically integrated prose that I have thus far read. Sorry I don't have the German here, but this is where a thing happens to the main character, the student Anselmus, that I'm sure we've all been through, where he's just walking around and he encounters 3 tiny snakes and falls in love with them because they have bell-like voices. And none of you? That's really not happened to any of you? So you are going to see how the senses come together to mediate this, kind of as we've seen, except I think it's perhaps fair to say even more dramatic. We may even be seeing some self-aware romantic self-parody by this point, just because Hoffmann is that aware. Here we go. Anselmus's strange self-communings were interrupted by a strange rushing, swishing sound, which started in the grass just beside him but soon slid up into the branches and foliage of the elder tree. At one moment, it sounded as though the evening breeze were shaking the leaves. At another moment, it sounded like birds billing and cooing. Then a whispering and lisping began, and the flowers seemed to tinkle like tiny crystal bells. Sorry for all these typos. As Anselmus listened more and more intently, the whispering and lisping and tinkling somehow turned into faint words trailing away on the breeze. Then, a trio of crystal bells seemed to peal out above his head. He looked up and saw 3 little snakes gleaming in green and gold, coiled round the branches and stretching their heads toward the evening sun. Then, he had heard it, he thought, whispering words, then convinced himself it was the breeze. Then the whispering words began again, and the snakes slithered caressingly up and down the leaves and branches, and their rapid movements made it seem as though the elder tree were scattering 1,000 sparkling emeralds amid its dark foliage. An electric shock seemed to penetrate his entire body. He trembled inwardly. He stared upwards and saw a pair of magnificent dark blue eyes looking at him with inexpressible yearning. As we go on, we find more and more throughout the text that is like this, and fragrance and smell comes in as this sort of third term in a way that I find absolutely fascinating. I'm going to speed along because I see that I am coming up on time here. I'm just going to say, well, first of all, Eichendorff, somewhat later Romantic writer, is an interesting case here because he has a story that is expressly about a traveling violinist and is a very unmusical text like we've been talking about. Then he has a text called Das Marmorbild, the marble image, the marble statue, which is very, very musical and has these musical, the music permeates that text in the way that it does some of these others, even though that one doesn't have musician characters. I'm just going to look at one more sort of counter example, which is Goethe's been around this whole time. He's still going. He has, of course, his progressive modes, and he, of course, has his rather rearguard kind of stance as well. Here, at least with respect to music, we are going to see him being so rearguard. Listen to this. Charlotte played exceedingly well on the piano. Edward not quite so well on the flute. It would have been difficult to have gone through a duet with him, but Charlotte knew how to manage it. She held in, or let herself be run away with, and fulfilled in this way the double part of a skillful conductor and a prudent housewife, who are able always to keep right on the whole, although particular passages will now and then fall out of order. So we don't hear a note, we don't hear a thing, but we see music here just as a social tool, just as a thing that functions in this rather realistic old school kind of way. Now, I'm not saying that is specifically Goethe's stance on musico-poetic relations. Far from it. It would take quite a long time to go through that. Only just that I wanted to draw attention to the fact that it's not one linear progression here that I see over the course of the early Romantic period. And similarly, okay, so first let me say what I do think is new here, and I will be done. We've already, prior to the Romantic period, had some musician characters, and that's not what I think is new here, even though we see more of them. As I said, I think we're seeing a much more tight integration of music into the actual stuff of the plots of prose fiction, even in a way that's quite separate from theorizing about music, from thinking about music. That also, however, plays a role in many of the texts, and yeah, I just would close by pointing out that given what we have seen with both a rather traditional narrative approach from Goethe's late text and Eichendorff's late text at the same time that he's writing this very musical thing, like I said, it's not a straight line, and Goethe does remain what I would call a stone to trouble the Romantic stream. And all of this does serve as a qualifying reminder that these two very unlike poetic tributaries, Goethe and the early Romantics, who I've just been talking about, Novalis and Schlegel and company, that all these very, very unlike sources all manage to contribute something quite great and significant to an ultimately very mighty river of German song. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks, everyone.